Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Redmen TV and your latest edition of Expert Insight. My name is Dan Clubb, and I'm delighted to say I'm joined by data journalist for Opta, David Segar. David, how you doing, mate? You okay?
Yeah, very good. Thanks. The sun's out and Liverpool have won. So, yeah, a very good start to the week.
Yeah, absolutely. I cannot complain. It is nice and sunny today, which is not in line with what's been going on for the rest of the summer. It looks like we're going to have one of them late summers again in September, doesn't it? And the summer's been pretty good for Liverpool, I think it's fair to say. Capped off with the signing of Ryan Gravenberch, of course. And we're here to talk about that man because you did a brilliant piece just the back end of last week on Gravenberch and just what he could offer to Liverpool, sort of what to expect from him and why he might be the man that we were looking for to finish the midfield rebuild. Now, it's interesting because the last time we spoke, we did a whole show on Liverpool's perfect defensive midfielder and who we should be going to get. And not once, I don't think, did we mention Gravenberch, nor did we mention Endo. So more fool us, of course, but it's fascinating, the Gravenberch stuff, because I don't think anyone's quite sure where and how he does fit. So let's talk about it. Now, one of the first points I wanted to talk with you about from the piece, you referenced his time at Ajax playing in a double pivot alongside Eds and Alvarez, who now, of course, at West Ham. Do you think that is a potential option for him? And just how successful was he in that role at Ajax? Why was he so good there doing that?
I think with that role obviously next to Alvarez, he had plenty of defensive cover with him, which I think helped. And I think that's why a lot of the mention of him being a six was maybe a little misleading, because he was a six in the sense that he was playing deep, but he wasn't a defensive midfielder. That was just his starting position, really. But as I say, it was next to Alvarez, who very much was a defensive midfielder. And of course, at Ajax in the Eredivisie, they're not as dominant as they used to be, but they were still one of the best teams, and so they didn't have to do all that much defending. So there wasn't really much of part of Gravenberch's game. But in that role, he excelled in that season. As I mentioned in the article, particularly in the Champions League, was interesting because the previous year was his first major season with Ajax. He played about 9 games a season before being slowly integrated into the team. But then Erik ten Hag brought him in as a regular part of the team in the 2021 season. And that season he played mostly as an 8. He played a little bit deeper, but mostly it was as an 8. And a lot of his stats that season were very impressive. But in particular, in the Champions League, they really weren't. And that was the season Ajax were in the same group as Liverpool. And I think they finished third and went into the Europa League that year. And so it wasn't, I think it was a little bit of him realizing that level is a bit higher than the Eredivisie and he'd need to learn a bit from that. But the 21-22 season, which was when he moved deeper to play next to Alvarez, his numbers in the Eredivisie went down a little bit across the board. Like his passing, the number of passes he was making went down, but that doesn't necessarily mean he wasn't getting as involved. I think it was possibly just the role had been changed slightly. His passing accuracy went up a bit, but in the Champions League, his passing accuracy went up a lot. In the previous season, I think it had only been around just over 80%, but it went up to just below 90 the season after. And Ajax won all 6 of their group games in the Champions League that year. I mean, they did have a slightly easier group, it must be said, than the season prior. But I think they still had Dortmund and Sporting in their group that year, so it wasn't a very, very easy one. But yeah, his numbers went up quite a lot in that competition, which obviously you would think is maybe a bit more of a proving ground than the Eredivisie when you're talking about the top leagues. And it's I think Ten Hag was testing him a bit then, because he'd seen obviously what he could do as an 8. And he had impressed that previous season, even if his passing wasn't quite as accurate. Obviously, he was making his passes higher up the pitch, so they were going to be more dangerous. So it was likely to be lower. But I think he was just trying to make him a more rounded player, and I think it worked, even if his performances in the Bundesliga maybe didn't suggest as much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's an interesting one because, like I said, I think we're all relatively excited about the Gravenberch signing because we've seen what he did at Ajax. We obviously courted him for a long time. I think Klopp's had his eye on him for a long period now. Obviously makes his move to Bayern, doesn't work out, but positionally it's probably more fascinating than anything else because, as you mentioned there, he probably wants to be, his preference would be as an 8 and be a bit more advanced. And I think you mentioned in the piece that even when he was at 6, he was kind of drifting out to the left a little bit and trying to do a bit more of that type of stuff and be the guy that he wants to be, I guess. Do you think he was at home in that role, or do you think it didn't suit him? How would you describe it?
I think there was element. I mean, again, it's difficult to to judge because it's Ajax, and so that he was supposed to be playing as a deeper line midfielder. But as you said, the touch zone map I looked at for that season, if you didn't know that he was supposed to be playing as a defensive midfielder, or the deeper midfielder, you would assume he was playing on very much an attacking 8 on the left, because a lot of his touches were in those areas of the pitch. So I don't know if it was just a case of, because he was still only 19, I think, at the time. So just that youthful exuberance of thinking, I want to get forward, because I think he definitely has an attack mind on him.
Yeah.
People will have seen from his YouTube clips that he loves a shot. He's got a very good shot on him from long range, albeit his shots to goal ratio isn't brilliant. So I think people might need to get used to the odd shot from range, which doesn't fly into the back of the net. But hopefully Klopp will keep that to a minimum. So he'll pick and choose his moments. But yeah, I think, as I said, with Ten Hag, putting him into that role, I think, was just to give him a better idea of the all-round job of a midfielder. And so his insistence on getting forward, obviously there's a part of it that Ajax were just on the attack most of the time, so he's going to be in those positions. But I don't think that necessarily means he lacks discipline or anything. I think it was just a case of that's what the game called for, and he had an idea of getting forward and trying to contribute in that area. But I'm sure with Klopp, I think we saw from his interview, or Klopp's interview after Gravenberch was signed, he made a point of saying that he's a box-to-box midfielder. So when I wrote the article, it was with the idea of saying it felt like we needed another 6. Gravenberch doesn't really look like he's that, but is he? So let's have a look and see if he is. And then I looked and thought, well, there's some things that suggest he might be. And then as soon as he signed, Klopp basically said, yeah, I'm going to play him as an 8. So it's kind of threw it out the window a little bit, but it was still interesting to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I do still maintain, certainly for the early part of his career at Liverpool, we'll see him using a whole host of different roles. We've seen that McAllister, of course, he played as the deepest of the 3 yesterday at time of recording. So yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. And one comparison that hasn't gone away really since he was sort of linked even a couple of weeks ago was the one with Gini Wijnaldum. And not just the Dutch thing, I think it goes a little bit beyond that, but I think it's his usage and how Klopp can sort of make him into something different, potentially how he can mould him. And you've dug a little bit deeper into that as well. Do you think there is a link there? Do you think the versatility and the intelligence of both footballers, do you think there is a match? And do you think we can do something different with Gravenberch that maybe nobody's done before?
Yeah, I think that's the exciting thing about Gravenberch, is that it was kind of the premise for the article as well, is that he's effectively feels like he's a bit of sort of clay that can be molded kind of player. Like he's being, again, not to generalize, as you say about Wijnaldum as well, but Dutch players tend to sort of have really, really good fundamentals in every area. So it feels like you can kind of use them in different areas and mold them to your various needs. And of course, coming through the Ajax academy as well, he was always going to be have great technique and good game awareness and good just to have a sort of good eye, good mind for the game. And I think with Klopp being such a fan of his, trying to sign him last year, I think it shows that he wasn't looking at Gravenberch as like, I need this specific type of player to fill this specific role. I think he just looked at him and thought, he's a really good player. I'll just bring him in and figure out how I'm going to use him when I actually get him in. So I think that's the exciting thing about him, is that we won't really know until, I mean, not even at the start, as you said, probably initially. In fact, I'm fairly certain initially he's going to play more often than not as an 8, but that doesn't mean that's where he's going to stay. So if he plays like that this season, that's not to say in 2, 3, 4 years time he couldn't become more of a 6, or if the system changes again, that he could take up another different role. And I think the comparisons to Wijnaldum, as I said, the fact that they're both Dutch probably ties into the fact that Dutch players tend to, as I said, have really good fundamentals. And I think that's why there'll be that comparison between Gravenberch and Wijnaldum. But I think it's also just because he's young, he's clearly got a good head on his shoulders. Klopp said in his interview as well that he was very impressed by him when he spoke to him. And I think that eagerness to learn, eagerness to develop, which again, I think we've seen from him being so willing to leave Bayern after just 1 year. It wasn't just a case. I think some people could look at it and say, oh, why did he just throw his toys out the pram because he wasn't getting regular games, a massive club in his first year? I think it was more a case of he knew for his development, he needs to play games and he needs to have a clearer idea of his role in the squad. And his role in the squad at Bayern, especially under Thomas Tuchel, was I'll play you for the last 5 minutes of games because I don't really rate you or have a role for you. And Tuchel said himself, like the role he feels Gravenberch is best in doesn't exist in his team, whereas Klopp believes it does in his. So I think he just saw an opportunity to go to another big club where he's got a clearer role in the team, and that's where he can develop. So I think if he has got that attitude of wanting to do whatever he can to develop as a player, and under Jurgen Klopp, you would think he should, then yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be an 80 for his whole career, but it should mean that Klopp can get something out of him wherever he plays in.
Yeah, definitely. I absolutely agree with you that wholeheartedly. I think the fact that he has moved away from Bayern should be looked at as a positive, because he clearly was unhappy and he felt like his development suffered as a consequence of his lack of game time. As you mentioned, Nagelsmann signed him, and I think the director, Salihamidzic, who signed him and was part of the transfer, they've both left the club now. So he's probably looking at it going, the fellas that brought me here aren't here anymore. Like, what exactly is my role? And as you mentioned, I think Tuchel referenced the fact he's behind Thomas Muller and Jamal Musiala in the pecking order, and he's probably looking at that going, I don't even want to play in that position necessarily, so I don't quite know how that works. But yeah, I think the fact he's come to Liverpool looking to kickstart himself again is a massive, massive tick in the box, personally. Just more generally now, we've spoken about sort of positionally and what he could become or what he might be to begin with. But in terms of his strengths and sort of his obvious key attributes that are impressive, what have you noticed from him looking at his research and sort of doing the numbers? What areas does he really stand out in?
I mean, he's very keen to get on the ball. Again, that was something that really stood out in his first full year at Ajax, or his first proper year at Ajax, which was the 2021 season, was considering he was 18 at the time. He was playing regularly for them, but he was attempting, I think it was just over 75 passes per 90 minutes, which last year, if you compare that to Liverpool's midfield, the only midfielder who was even getting close to that was Thiago. I won't say getting close to it, he had more, but Thiago was averaging just shy of 78. But the next was, I think, Henderson with 67. And then after that, it was Fabinho with 61. So Gravenberch was getting on the ball a lot. He was wanting the ball, attempting passes. His pass success rate, I say, that season was only around 82%. But I said that would have been further up the pitch. So would have been in tighter areas of the pitch. And probably, again, being young, maybe he was trying passes that were a bit too optimistic. But in terms of his forward passes as well, I think that's going to be a key at Liverpool, is not just obviously getting on the ball and moving it, but not wanting to be one of these midfielders who gets on the ball and is just passing it backwards, passing it back to the defence, having the easy balls. He's averaged, I think it's just shy of a third of his passes are forward, which is about right for a midfielder at the top level. And again, Liverpool's midfield, that's around the same again of how their average from last season. So I think at that young age, for him to be so confident to want the ball and to attempt as many passes as he did, bodes well. And as I said in the article, the Bundesliga season, you can't really put too much faith in the numbers there, because obviously it was so sporadic. His appearances coming off the bench for the last 5-10 minutes of games that were probably already won most of the time. But in terms of his passing numbers, as I said, in his second season at Ajax, they went up quite a bit. So he was clearly learning a lot in terms of how to keep hold of the ball in his passing game. Also dribbling. He loves a dribble, really, really loves a dribble, which I'm not certain how much chance he'll get to do it. Obviously, in the Premier League, you feel like midfields are a bit more congested. He perhaps had a bit more space in the Eredivisie and even in the Bundesliga. But yeah, last season, he's still, even in spite of, I said, you would think he'd have a lack of confidence because of his lack of game time, but he attempted, I think it was around 3.8 dribbles per 90 when he was on, which is ridiculous for a centre midfielder. No other Bayern midfielder averaged more than, or even averaged 1 per 90. So probably the likes of Kimmich and Goretzka and Sabitzer just weren't trying them. Like, maybe that's not their game. But Gravenberch got on the ball. He was turning and wanting to run at the opposition, which you could argue maybe that's something Klopp wanted as well, because that's something Romeo Lavia is very good at. And obviously we were targeting him earlier this summer. And so potentially that's something he wants from his midfielders is to get on the ball and actually try and open up that space by attempting dribbles. One area, as I mentioned in the article, that he potentially could be better at, and I think this probably lends itself to the fact that he attempts so many dribbles, is that he does also lose possession more often than you'd like, which obviously it's been a bit of a problem in our midfield. His midfielders losing possession, and then all of a sudden we could be opened up. So that's something he's going to have to look out for. And I think potentially if we maybe don't see him starting games straight away, that's possibly something that Klopp's going to be working with him on the training field. But at the same time, he'll be aware of that. Klopp will be aware of that. The club will be aware of all of his numbers. So anything like that, I'm sure they'll look to try and train out of him.